So, hello and welcome. I'm Terry Martin, and you are with views from both sides in forecasting the U.S. presidential race with two distinguished gentlemen who know a whole lot about this from both sides. That's why we have them here. It's really a great pleasure for me to introduce our two distinguished speakers. We've got with us Reince Priebus. He is the longest-serving chairman of the Republican National Committee and the former White House Chief of Staff serving under Donald Trump. We also have with us here a gentleman that I'm just meeting today for the first time. It's someone you may have seen before because he appears on CNN pretty much all the time. If you happen to watch CNN. We've got Paul Begala, CNN political commentator, Democratic strategist, and former advisor to Democratic President Bill Clinton, you may recall. Now, they're here to give us their views from both sides of the U.S. presidential election, so they're going to give you a really good roundup of where things are right now, just less than 2 months before that election, and there's been a lot of change within the campaigns because there's been a big switch of candidates, as you all know. Joe Biden is not running again for a second term, which is really quite something. We had an earthquake moment when suddenly Kamalaharris was announced as the candidate, and that changed the whole dynamic. So we're going to try to get a good grip on that today.
This is a historic race. I mean, obviously, even for Paul and I think we've seen about everything you can imagine in American politics. We've never seen anything like this, an historic nature where you've got a sitting president getting ready to be on a re-election campaign. He wants to run, but decides not to, and giving up his place for his vice president. So I'm looking forward to this conversation. I'm grateful to be here.
So thank you for having me here. If I can, a little bit about the race. Reince is exactly right. We have seen everything in this race and nothing. This is what I mean. For the first time since 1981, we had a presidential candidate shot at. President Reagan was president. He was shot in 1981. And thank God he survived. In 1981, when that happened, President Reagan went from approval in the 40s to 73. Trump went from 41 to 42. That's it. 1 point bounce from the most shocking, horrible thing that I've seen in decades.
He's referring, of course, to the event where Donald Trump, his ear was nicked by a bullet. He was bleeding. Someone was killed.
It was an assassination attempt. It was horrible. And yet, he didn't gain anything politically. I thank God he's alive. Then we had a debate, which we do all the time, and for the first time in history, it drove one of the candidates out. Biden was so terrible in the debate that he had to get out of the race. And Trump went from about 42 to 43. It was it. Almost no change again. Then Kamala Harris gets in, and that's the one thing that's made a difference in this race. The Democrats were really sliding, and now she has brought them back.
But has it really made a difference? I mean, this is the big question. I mean, the latest polls came out, show them pretty much neck and neck.
Oh, yeah.
And they've got a 3 percentage point margin of error in those polls, and they're still running pretty much neck and neck. Do you guys think things would be this close?
Well, okay. It's made a difference in the sense of Donald Trump versus Joe Biden. Donald Trump versus Joe Biden, it probably would have been a landslide. So it's made a difference in the sense that Kamala Harris has brought this race back to a horse race. But if you look at the polling today, and as of yesterday, the polling is essentially absolutely tied. It's tied practically nationwide, and it's tied in all of the battleground states that actually matter. And as you know, and I won't bore you with the details, but we don't have a national election in the United States. We have an election basically in 7 states that matter. Most importantly, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania. Those are the 3 states that probably matter the most. And I will tell you that less than 70,000 people will decide who wins this election in those 7 states. The second thing I want to tell you is that the issues that matter the most to the voters are issues that favor Donald Trump. The reason why Kamala Harris can't get ahead in any significant way against Donald Trump is that the issues that matter to the American people are the economy, where Donald Trump is ahead by 18 percentage points, according to the New York Times, inflation, where Donald Trump is ahead by 25%, and the border, where Donald Trump is ahead by over 20 points on the border. So inflation, the economy, the border, what is the price of gas and groceries? Donald Trump wins across the board. So, that being the case, Kamala Harris is trying to make herself the change candidate. Even though she's associated with Joe Biden, she's trying to make herself the change candidate over Donald Trump. And that's where the battle is, on the issues and who is going to be the change candidate moving forward.
Paul, I know you want to respond to that.
Yeah, what does it tell you? Trump's really not ahead by 18 on the economy. 6 in some polls, maybe.
Well,
I saw the highest I saw
I'm
was
talking
16.
about the CBS poll this morning.
Excuse me. So
I'm speaking.
You're interrupting.
Kamala Harris.
You're interrupting. What does it tell you that someone is ahead by, say, 18? Say Reince is right. 18 points in the economy, but he's not ahead in the vote. The American people don't want Trump. Now, whether they want the Democratic alternative is another matter. But Donald Trump is in his 3rd presidential campaign. And yet, in all of this long career, he has not had one day where he had 50% support among his fellow Americans. Ever. Not one day. That must be heartbreaking for Mr. Trump. It must be frustrating for my Democrats that they're still tied with him. But there's deep resistance to him. So this question of change is very important. There's only 2 messages in life, by the way. There are. No, seriously, every decision is, do we stay the course, or is it time for a change?
Sure.
So your business, your marriage, right, your football team, whatever it is, and Americans do want to change. Biden was unacceptable as a change candidate. He was the incumbent president, and he was 81 years old. Okay, I know Korea goes back 5,000 years. America is only 248 years old. And Joe Biden's been alive for 1/3 of American history. Do the math. So has Mr. Trump. So in comes Kamala, younger, more dynamic, change incarnate, and poor Trump doesn't know what to do. He doesn't know whether to scratch his watch or wind his bottom.
So you're saying age is an issue?
It's a huge issue.
Trump is
Huge.
78, Kamala Harris 59.
It disqualified Biden. It knocked him out of the race. So with the
now
Democrats,
the tables have turned, you're saying?
Yes. What the Democrats want to do, well, look, political parties, Reince ran one, I helped run one, they exist to win. That's it. They're not a family which loves you unconditionally. They're not a church which keeps a one true faith. You win or you're out. Biden couldn't win, so he's out. I don't think Trump can win, but his party has become a cult of personality. If they had nominated Nikki Haley, Chris Christie, Brian Kemp, I could give you 5 Republicans who would have whipped any Democrat.
Okay, the issues. We heard Reince come out and say, okay, the issues, the economy, inflation, the border, by which he means immigration. Are there any discernible differences in terms of the campaigns when it comes to focusing on issues?
Oh, yeah. First off, one big difference that Kamala Harris has made for the Democrats is she's engaging on cost of living. By the way, it's important for politicians to call it cost of living, not inflation. Inflation is for economists. Cost of living is how we live. Right? And here's the difference. When eggs in America hit their high point in summer of 2023, they were $4.86 a dozen. That's heartbreaking. Now they're only $3.05. So Biden wanted to go around saying, give me credit because I cut the cost of eggs from $4.86 to $3.05. Guess what? The day he was sworn in, they were $1.58. Okay, so that mom making breakfast for her kids is not very happy that eggs are still twice as much as they were when. So Kamala says, she doesn't say, I've done a great job like Joe did. She says, I know costs are too high, and I can help you bring them down. Okay, I'm going to take on price gouging at the grocery store. I'm going to take on big oil ripping you off at the pump. I'm going to take on pharmaceutical companies who are charging you too much, and insurance companies who charge you too much for your. So she is meeting people where they live and saying, I will drop your costs. And what I wish she would do is turn to Mr. Trump, who is the face of greedflation. Do you know Donald Trump charges $18 for a hamburger at Trump Tower?
Okay.
$18 for a hamburger? Are you kidding?
Reince, we're talking eggs and hamburgers here. Is this going to determine the election?
It's a big part of the election. I mean, Paul's right. I mean, you can get into the clouds over why do we have this inflation? Why did the government put all this money into the economy? We've got too much money chasing too few goods. But the concept of inflation is very complicated. So Paul's right. I mean, people look at how are we doing when it comes to my car insurance, a ticket to a reasonable flight somewhere that I need to go to, the price of eggs, milk. That, in most people's minds, is the American economy. And those are the issues that are really floating out there for these candidates that are now debating each other, and they're going to say, whose fault is it that this is the price of these goods that is making it difficult for me and my family to live? So the challenge for Donald Trump is, in this very bizarre kind of situation where you've got the sitting vice president divorcing herself of the Biden economy, is to say, wait a second, you're at fault for the reasons why this economy is where it's at. You're the reason why. So the challenge for Trump is to get the American people to, when they look at Kamala Harris, is to consider that she's an extension of Joe Biden. And if you look at the last two polls, I don't know if you saw, there were some warning signs for Kamala Harris on this issue. Because when people were asked which candidate is the candidate of change, most people said it was Donald Trump. And that's a bad sign for Kamala Harris. As to Trump's personality, look, I get it. And for some people, they don't go for it. I get it. But you have to consider that when people are angry, when people are upset about what's happening in the American economy, the border, the world, I used to say Donald Trump represents the biggest middle finger the American people could find. And that is essentially part of the issue. And people are upset. And the question is whether or not, the issues of the economy outweigh, for some people, the issues of Trump's personality. And that is going to be this debate that will continue to go on and on and on.
I wanted to get back to the economy issue, because the economy brings in a lot of things, right? The economy consists also of foreign trade, right? That affects the economy. Migration affects the economy, all of these things. So I want to broaden out the discussion a little bit to include what's happening in this part of the world, because some are concerned that another Donald Trump presidency could result in a more isolationist trade policy towards Asia, for example. So I'm just wondering what you can tell the people, our audience here in South Korea, about what the two candidates would be doing in terms of foreign trade, and we'll broaden this out to foreign relations after that.
Sure. As to the issue of the Indo-Pacific region, the one thing I will tell you that there is agreement on is China. There's varying degrees of agreement on China, but there is generally an agreement that that confronting China, who's ripping off the world, is something that both parties are interested in exploring as to what that means moving forward, whether it means trade, tariffs, import tax, export credits, all those things that come into play when it comes to the issue of China. As far as generally, though, in the region, there's great agreement on where we are with our friends in South Korea. I mean, there's just no question about it, as Paul mentioned right off the bat eloquently, that this is a beacon of freedom in Asia that we as Americans, both Republicans and Democrats, want to support, and that we want to be cooperative allies together moving forward. That being said, America First and Donald Trump is confrontational when it comes to the issues of who pays what for these agreements. What does cooperation look like when it comes to steel and aluminum and trade? How are we going to work together as technologies become more of a focal point in the United States? And I know we can get into these issues, but I think where the opportunities are going to be in South Korea and in the Philippines and Japan and all of our allies here in the South Pacific is that it's where the cooperation begins. So if you're a corporation out there that's making technologies, whether it comes to chips, whether it becomes, in media, in equipment for drilling and energy, it's about moving independently forward inside of the United States to say, we are here, we want to cooperate, how can we help get you where you need to go in this technology? So you're going to see a lot more, I think, cooperation among the two countries, or all of us here in the region that are working together when it comes to getting everyone down to the finish line on these technologies, on the chips, working together, moving forward. And I would suggest to y'all to be proactive when it comes to cooperation with the United States. Don't wait for the government to come forward and say, here's what we're doing on chips and technology and equipment. Move forward.
Okay. We did see a bit of a change, of course, when Joe Biden took over from Donald Trump as president of the United States when it comes to tariffs and trade. But Biden kept a lot of Trump's policies when it came that were introduced at that time. Paul, what would change with Kamala Harris? Would we see more continuity in terms of trade with Asia, particularly East Asia, where we happen to be right now, or would there be? Or do you expect some differences?
Yes, I think she wants to continue and expand the trade that we have, which means not slapping a bunch of tariffs like Trump did on washing machines from Korea. It means not raising the price of a Hyundai Tucson by another $1,000. The Economic Club of New York last week hosted Mr. Trump, and it's a really important speech. It scared the hell out of me. I worked for Bill Clinton, okay? He knew something about the economy. And I watched the whole thing, and it was frightening. He literally said he wants America's economy to go back to William McKinley, 1896. He died in 1901. Okay, so old McKinley's been gone 123 years. And he financed the American government on tariffs. This is before we had an income tax. Trump said, that's what I want. He wants to finance my country's government on tariffs rather than rich people paying income taxes. That's what he said. It's astonishing. So he wants to tax everything coming out of China at least 60%, everything coming out of Korea and the whole rest of the world another 10%. For an American middle-class family, that is a tax increase of $4,000 a year. But if you repeal the income tax, what it saves Mr. Trump's fellow billionaires is an astonishing amount of money. So it would be this spectacular transfer of wealth hitting the middle class. By the way, it would also hurt the Indo-Pacific. It would hurt our relations in South America, in Europe, in Africa. It would be the most radical change, I guess, since Teddy Roosevelt, who brought us into the 20th century. It's hard to explain how radical this is. I really commend that speech. To his great credit, Mr. Trump laid it all out there. And he said, quite honestly, he wants to raise taxes on everything you produce and sell here. The Bank of Korea looked at this, by the way, and said the tariffs alone would reduce the GDP of Korea because your exports to China would drop tremendously, because then if you export things to China, China sells them to America, they cost 60% more. So it would be economic disaster if you would see that. And I just don't think that's the way that a modern economy should run.
I want to move on, just broaden it back out a bit now. These two candidates, American voters are going to be going to the polls in less than 2 months now. There's not much time left to change their minds. Yeah. We have a Kamala Harris that people don't seem to know as much about as they would like to know. They do know a lot about Donald Trump, what to expect. Donald Trump is holding very well in the polls. Kamala Harris has not been able to capitalize that much yet on her coming in as a fresh candidate. What are the biggest obstacles that these two candidates have to overcome in order to win this election on November 5th? Start with you, Reince.
Biggest obstacles, I think that Kamala Harris is going to have to overcome articulating a message in a populist world in the United States when her record is much different than what I think the American people want to hear right now. So you heard a lot about what Paul said about how, Donald Trump's confronting all of these countries about military cooperation. Well, if you're in the middle of Nebraska or Wisconsin or Pennsylvania, and you ask the question, should countries that are being protected by the United States, I'm not suggesting that's that simple, but if you're being asked that question, should they bear some of the financial burden for that cost? So most people say, yeah, people should share. People should share the burden. Well, I understand it's much more complicated than that. We have interests here. We have world interests. We have a responsibility. I get it. We all do together as friends. We have a responsibility together. I get it. I'm not saying that. But what I'm suggesting to you is that when the question is asked on fundamental fairness, if you're being taxed 20% on goods from a particular country and you tax nothing on their goods, do you think that's fair? To people listening and say, you know what, that doesn't sound fair to me. And Donald Trump's delivering that message. So she's going to have to overcome this piece. And then the other thing is Donald Trump has to, I think, overcome, an advantage on the ground that the Democrats have in these really close races. This is boring stuff to you, but winning presidential elections in the United States come down to a lot of boring things. Knowing everything about you as a candidate, what beer you drink, what car you drive, how many kids you have, whether your mortgage is right side up or upside down, what color your truck is, and that'll tell you how you're going to vote. And we target all those people. And like I said, remember, 50, 60,000 people voting one way or the other in 6 states. That's what it comes down to. I think the Democrats have a little advantage over the Republicans there. The second thing, though, is just remember, Donald Trump was way behind in 2016 by 4 or 5 points. He won. Remember, he was supposed to get crushed by Joe Biden in 2020. He barely lost. So when the polls tell you that it's a tie race or Kamala Harris is slightly ahead or slightly behind, that's good news for Donald Trump.
Kamala Harris, can she do populist? Reince just suggested that this is a populist environment in the U.S. Can she do that?
It is a populist moment, and she's running against a billionaire. It should be easy. So yes, and this is part of, I think, what has Mr. Trump so frustrated, is that she's running as a change candidate, and he thought he had that lane. The two things that are going to drive this is who's the future versus the past. Who's change versus more of the same? She is claiming that mantle in a way Biden never tried and never could. She's saying, I am the future, I am change, he is the past. And when you're running for the 3rd time in a row, it's easier to make you a part of the past. Then she's saying, I'm for the people, he's for himself. Okay? And when, again, he charges $300 for the ugliest sneakers you've ever seen in your life. Michael Jordan only charges $200. He's Michael Jordan. Okay, I mean, he charges $60 for the Holy Bible. You can get it in a bookstore for $10. And you know what he does with the other $50? He goes out in Mar-a-Lago, he throws it up in the air and says, Lord, take what you need and send the rest back down to me. So it's easy, I think, to pose Trump as a guy who's in it for himself. I may be unfair. I don't like him. But he strikes me as somewhat self-absorbed. And I think Vice President Harris can use that to say, look, I'm for you, and he's for himself. Yes, he's a fighter. God knows he's a fighter. But he's not fighting for you. He's fighting for himself. This is, by the way, a very different message than what the Democrats were saying, which is he's evil, he's racist, he's sexist. I don't want to attack his personality at all. That's baked in. Some people love it, some hate it. I want to attack his policies. And say, if you want a $4,000 a year tax increase on the middle class so that he can give tax cuts for the rich, if you want to repeal Obamacare, if you want to repeal abortion rights even further, or contraception, or IVF, in other words, those are issues that affect people's lives. And the trap with Trump is that he is so eccentric that he draws attention to those eccentricities, okay, which many people find to be racist and sexist and offensive. Other people find to be wonderful and heroic. That's done. That is settled. It's much more important for the Democrats to talk about your life than his.
Okay. I'm afraid we're out of time.
It's
It's
a shame.
very unfortunate because this has been a wonderful conversation. I feel terribly privileged to have both of you here,
thank you,
especially
Terry.
so close to,
Well, we
to
love
the
being here.
debate
Yes.
that's coming up.
I'm coming back. Believe me, I love this country,
Yeah.
and I've
That-
really, you
that-
guys have been great to me.
Thank
so
you for having us.
That debate,
Yes.
yep. Warm round of applause.
All right, thank you.
for you
Right,
guys
great
here.
job.